October 17th, 1944. A small train station outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. The platform is empty except for a single MP and a handful of local farmers in worn denim, leaning against a fence post, watching. The train pulls in, and from its cramped cars emerge 43 German prisoners of war, officers mostly, faces still carrying the dust of North Africa and the hard lines of command. They step onto American soil expecting something, barbed wire certainly. Guard towers, the cold efficiency of a military machine. What they do not expect is what happens next. But before we understand what broke inside these men that autumn, we must first understand what they believed they were walking into. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were Wehrmacht officers, men who had once commanded battalions, who had read the intelligence reports, who had been told again and again during their training in Bremen and Munich about the nature of the American enemy. The reports were consistent. America, they were assured, was a nation of profound weakness, a country divided by race, crippled by labor strikes, where the farmers were inefficient and the workers soft. A land where discipline had been replaced by democracy, where men argued instead of obeyed. One Luftwaffe colonel, Klaus Bergmann, wrote in his diary before his capture in Tunisia, "They have the factories, yes, but they do not have the will. A nation of shopkeepers and Hollywood actors cannot sustain a war of true sacrifice." This was the lens through which they viewed their captivity. They expected chaos. They expected the reflection of their own propaganda, and for the first few days, as they were processed through the intake facility in Algona, Iowa, their expectations seemed confirmed in the strangest of ways. The camp itself was not what they anticipated. There were fences, yes, but they were low, almost symbolic. There were guards, but they were older men, some in their 50s, far from the front. And there were houses, small barracks to be sure, but clean, with windows, with stoves. The food that first night was beyond comprehension. Roast chicken, fresh bread, butter, real butter. Hauptmann Friedrich Steinecker, who had not seen butter since 1942, wrote to his wife in a letter that would be censored but later preserved. "I thought perhaps it was a trick, a final meal before some darker purpose. But the guards ate the same food. They sat at the next table, and they ate the same chicken." It was the first crack in the narrative. But the true fracture, the moment that would haunt these men for the rest of their lives, came not in the camp, but in the fields. The harvest of 1944 was in crisis. Every able-bodied American man between 18 and 35 was gone, swallowed by the war in Europe and the Pacific. The farms of Iowa, which fed not just America but the Allied armies overseas, were facing a catastrophic labor shortage. The corn was ready, the soybeans were heavy on the stalk, and there was no one to bring them in. The government solution was pragmatic to the point of irony: use the enemy. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be employed in non-military labor, and they would be paid 80 cents a day. The farmers would pay the government, and the prisoners would receive credit. And so, on October 19, 1944, Friedrich Steinecker and 42 other German officers were loaded onto flatbed trucks and driven into the heartland of their enemy. They did not yet know that this journey would rewrite everything they understood about the nation they had been sent to destroy. The truck stops at the edge of a cornfield that stretches to the horizon. The prisoners step down, blinking in the flat, endless light of the prairie. An old farmer, maybe 60, walks toward them. He is not in uniform. He wears denim overalls and a faded cap, and in his hand is a thermos of coffee. He looks at the German officers, men who 2 years ago might have been shelling his son's position in France. And he says, through the interpreter, "You boys work hard. There'll be cold water and sandwiches at noon." Then he turns and walks back toward the barn. No speech, no ideology, just the plain expectation of labor and reciprocity. Steinecker, standing in that field, writes later, "I did not know what to do with his kindness. It had no place in the war, I understood, and that was only the beginning. Because what happened over the next 8 weeks would systematically dismantle every assumption these men carried. They worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, under the October sun and the November frost. They picked corn by hand, loaded wagons, repaired fences, hauled hay. The work was hard, far harder than the administrative duties many of them had known in the Wehrmacht. But it was the details, the small, unguarded moments, that began to accumulate like evidence in a trial they hadn't known they were part of. The farmer's wife, a woman in her 50s named Margaret Kowalski, brought them lemonade in the afternoon. She did not speak German, and they did not speak English, but she poured the drinks herself and handed them out, cup by cup. One of the younger officers, a lieutenant named Dieter Fuchs, asked the interpreter, "Why does she do this? We are the enemy." The interpreter, a second-generation German-American from Dubuque, shrugged and said, "She doesn't see you that way. She sees men working her land." It was an answer that made no sense within the framework of total war. And yet, it was the truth. On November 3rd, the first snow came early, dusting the fields white. The work slowed, but it did not stop. The prisoners were given gloves, heavy coats from a surplus store in town. Steinecker wrote, "They give us their equipment, not cast-offs, but good wool, good leather." I asked the guard why, and he looked confused by the question. He said, "You'll freeze otherwise," as if that were reason enough. And then, on November 8th, something happened that none of them had prepared for. The harvest was finished. The last wagon was loaded, the final field cleared. And the farmer, a man named Robert Henshaw, did something that would be reported in the camp and debated in letters home for months. He walked into the barn where the prisoners were waiting for the truck, and he shook each man's hand, one by one. He looked them in the eye and said, in slow, deliberate English, that the interpreter carefully translated, "Thank you. You saved my farm." Then he handed the interpreter an envelope. Inside were $43, $1 for each man. A gift beyond the wages already paid. The truck ride back to the camp was silent. Steinecker sat in the back holding that single dollar bill, and he could not reconcile it with the enemy he had been trained to fight. This was not weakness. It was something else, something his entire ideological framework had no language for. That night, he began a letter to his brother, still fighting on the Eastern Front. He wrote, "We were told they are divided, that they have no unity, no strength of purpose. But I have seen something here that I cannot explain. They do not hate us. They do not fear us. They simply expect us to behave as they do, with fairness, with labor, with a handshake at the end. And in that expectation, there is a power more terrifying than any weapon, because it is not a power that destroys. It is a power that assumes its own victory so completely that it can afford to be kind." The letter was never sent. It was found in his belongings after the war, preserved in a small wooden box. But what it describes is the beginning of a realization that would ripple through the camps. By December, word had spread. Other camps, other work details, reported similar experiences. German prisoners working in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in California, all writing letters home or to each other, describing the same paradox. They had expected brutality and received fairness. They had expected propaganda and received silence. They had expected a weak, divided nation and instead encountered farmers who paid them, fed them, and thanked them. A captured Panzer commander Otto Friedrich wrote in his diary, "I begin to understand why we are losing. Not because they have more tanks, though they do. Not because they have more planes, though they do. But because they have built a society that can send its men to war and still bring in the harvest. They do not choose between strength and decency. They assume both are possible. And that assumption is the thing we cannot defeat." It was a recognition that came too late, but it came nonetheless. The winter of 1944 turned into the spring of 1945. The war in Europe ground toward its conclusion, And in camps across America, German prisoners of war were learning something that no intelligence briefing, no propaganda pamphlet, no ideological training had prepared them for. They were learning that the enemy they had been taught to despise was not what they had been told. The American farmer who thanked them for the harvest was not weak. He was confident. The guard who shared his cigarettes was not undisciplined. He was secure. The system that paid them for their labor, that fed them the same food, that treated them with a baseline of respect, was not a system on the verge of collapse. It was a system so deeply rooted, so fundamentally stable, that it could afford to treat even its enemies as human beings. And that, more than any battle, more than any bombing raid, was the revelation that shattered the narrative. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. In the camp outside Cedar Falls, the prisoners gathered in the main hall to hear the news. There was no celebration, but there was also no despair. Just a quiet, stunned acceptance. Steinecker sat on his bunk that night and took out the dollar bill Robert Henshaw had given him 6 months before. He had kept it, folded carefully in his Bible, and he looked at it now as if it were a coded message he was only just beginning to understand. Later he would write in his memoir, published in Germany in 1963, "We lost the war on the battlefield, yes. But I think we lost it long before that. We lost it the moment we convinced ourselves that kindness was weakness, that decency was inefficiency, that a nation which treated its enemies with fairness was a nation that could be defeated. We were wrong, and that wrongness cost us everything." The memoir sold poorly. But among those who read it, the passage was underlined again and again. The prisoners began to return home in late 1945 and throughout 1946. They came back to a Germany in ruins, to cities that no longer existed, to families fractured by loss. And they brought with them stories that no one quite believed. Stories of American camps where the food was plentiful, where the guards were fair, where farmers shook your hand and paid you for your work. To a population that had been bombed, starved, and occupied, these stories sounded like fantasies, like the delusions of men who had been broken by captivity. But the stories persisted, and slowly, in the conversations in beer halls and in letters between veterans, a new understanding began to emerge. The Americans had not won because they were crueler. They had won because they had not needed to be. There is a photograph, taken in 1983 at a reunion in Waterloo, Iowa. It shows an elderly German man, Friedrich Steinecker, standing next to an elderly American farmer, Robert Henshaw. They are both in their 70s now, and they are smiling. The photograph was taken by Henshaw's granddaughter, and in the caption, Steinecker is quoted as saying, "I came here as an enemy. I left as a man who understood what he had been fighting against. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to tell people that the greatest strength is not the willingness to destroy, but the confidence to build, even in the presence of your enemy." Henshaw, for his part, said only, "He was a good worker. That's all I needed to know." The story of the German officers who were shocked by American farmers is not a story about propaganda or politics. It is a story about a fundamental miscalculation. The Wehrmacht had been trained to see kindness as a vulnerability, decency as a tactical weakness. They had been taught that total war required total ruthlessness, and that any nation which hesitated, which treated its enemies with even a shred of humanity, was a nation that could be exploited. But what they discovered in those fields in Iowa, in those camps across America, was that they had misunderstood the nature of strength. They had mistaken confidence for weakness. They had mistaken stability for softness. And by the time they realized their error, the war was already over. The harvest had been brought in, and the men who had once been their enemies had moved on, leaving behind only the memory of a handshake and a dollar bill, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that some things cannot be defeated because they were never in doubt.